The Memphis Grizzlies remain one of the NBA's youngest teams. That means despite their successes, there's still plenty of room for improvement. I dive into 3 ways that Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, and the team overall can grow in year 4 of the Grizz Next Gen era on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in. Thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day here on the Locked On Network, your team every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. It's remarkable when you look at what the Memphis Grizzlies do. And I've been looking at the Memphis Grizzlies and what they do for roughly a decade now. Host Joe Mullinax joining you here. And I really am fascinated to see how the team has changed in such a short amount of time. It's truly, truly worthy of pause, because I still remember a time where this team was directionless, rudderless, going up a certain creek without a paddle, you could say, one that you're not supposed to say on a friendly podcast. But they are here now as a contender, despite their age, despite their youth, despite the fact that so many, including myself, were skeptical that they would get to this point. They have arrived. They are one of the very best teams in the NBA far before anyone expected it. And now, before them, lay another opportunity to be a potential contender for the NBA Finals. And yet, one of the positives that doesn't necessarily get talked about as much, because with it, the connotation of potential negativity can be construed or misconstrued, perhaps. There's lots of room for growth among this roster. Even among the very best players on the team, there's room for growth. So on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, you'll notice my co-host, Michael Cole, is not with me on this show. Busy time of year. We'll get back together. But I want to have a conversation about the idea of improvement for the very best players on this Grizzlies roster, starting with the best player on the Grizzlies roster. You may have heard of him, Ja Morant. Just because you are one of the top 10 players in the National Basketball Association, which is true, of course, in the case of Ja Morant, that doesn't mean that you do not have room for improvement. And the first person that would tell you that is T. Morant, Ja's father. But beyond that, Ja Morant would also say the same thing. Despite the new contract, despite the rumors of a signature shoe, all the wonderful things that are coming Ja's way, deservedly so, there is still an avenue where Morant can not just attack the lane literally, but also figuratively, the lane of growth in terms of how he plays the game of basketball. And that line for these Memphis Grizzlies will continue to be walked because, on one hand, as mentioned before, they are a contender. They are viewed as one of the top 10 teams in the National Basketball Association. And depending on your definition, that makes you, at the very least, a dark horse challenger for the NBA throne currently held by the Golden State Warriors. However, they've gotten younger in the past offseason. They remain one of the youngest teams in the entire NBA. And that, because of the lack of a major move, no, Jay Crowder doesn't count if it happens. The lack of a major move leads the Grizzlies to continue to be in that space, that weird nether region of we're contending, but we're not making moves to impact the future. We want to compete for a championship, but not at the expense of 3 or 4 years from now when we're going to be capped out because Desmond Bane and Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. and others are all getting paid, depending on who they decide to extend. So that space for growth being there still is a positive thing. It's not meant to be a knock on anybody. And Ja Morant is a great starting example of this idea. With Ja, and Chris Harrington wrote about this for the Daily Memphian recently, and it was inspiring for me. And I was already kind of thinking this. I don't have a blog anymore to write these thoughts down. Fansided has done a great job, and I have a lot of exciting work coming out through Fansided and in the weeks coming up to preview the NBA season. But the important thing is, in terms of writing about the Grizzlies, I don't have that easy avenue that I used to have with Grizzly Bear Blues. Chris Harrington beat me to the punch, and he talked about how less could be more for Ja Morant, not just in terms of scoring, but in terms of the offense revolving around him. He was number one with a bullet on the Grizzlies in terms of usage last season. He was also, according to Cleaning the Glass, 96th percentile in terms of usage among all point guards in the NBA. That puts him right near the tippy top. Now, of course, when you have, again, one of the top 8 to 10 best players in the NBA on your team, you're going to want them to shoot the basketball a lot. You're going to want to center your offense around that individual. But the only issue, or the main issue perhaps, with that philosophy is that Ja was so high in terms of usage, but in terms of what he did off of those play designs and attempts was not where it should be, especially for someone of his skill set as a passer. He was in the 6th percentile in assist rate compared to usage. Now, that's not as damning as it sounds, because again, he was so important to scoring the basketball. He led the NBA in points in the paint as a guard. He did so much for the Grizzlies offensively as a scorer. It doesn't say that Ja is selfish or anything along those lines. It just means that he didn't have very much help, or at least he needed to do things more on his own than perhaps a fully healthy offense would suggest. And we'll talk more about that later on in our conversation here. He was so dependent upon to score and contribute in that way at that level at all times that, again, it may not be sustainable, much like saying that the Grizzlies were probably going to take a step back anyway as that number 2 overall seed in the NBA. The same could be true of what Morant did in terms of his focus offensively last season. He has the talent. Any viewing of a highlight film can tell you that. Ja Morant can make the pass, and he consistently looks to get his teammates involved. So in some ways, it's a two-way street. You got to finish the shot. You got to finish the pass off of a Morant dish out into the corner for an open corner 3, or on an alley-oop opportunity that maybe goes awry. There were plenty of opportunities last year for that number to perhaps be a little bit higher that the assist wasn't completed, but it goes both ways. Ja would continuously, as he becomes more of a focal point of opposing game plans, because nobody's going to let Ja Morant get what he wants as easily as he has in the past. Maybe he's still able to do that because he's that darn good, but he's going to be very much the centerpiece if he wasn't already. Teams are going to study what the Minnesota Timberwolves, what the Golden State Warriors, what other teams have done that have some semblance of success, more so Minnesota than Golden State, and try to see how they can apply similar things within their schemes, within their rotations to try to slow Ja. So he needs to continue to keep that mentality of being a creator for others, which again is already kind of prevalent in his psyche, the way that he operates. It just needs to continue to not be given up on, to not just say, I'm a scoring guard. And I don't know that Morant would do that in the first place, but within his game, continuing to stay true to himself as a creator for others. That is a vital part. Because again, that 6th percentile is pretty low for a point guard. You wouldn't necessarily expect that of somebody of the passing acumen of Morant. So some of it is his teammates helping him out. Some of it is Ja continuing to, when he has the defense center and focus around him, the floater may not always be the most effective shot. Look out to another player on the perimeter. Get the extra pass. Get some swings moving in terms of getting the ball around the horn. On the other end of the floor, in terms of defense, we're going to talk more about the idea of the offense needing to adjust in the lead up to training camp and the lead up to the preseason and the games getting started here in a few weeks. The transition opportunities in some ways are going to have to come from Ja himself in terms of improving his own luck with regard to transition baskets. He was better in terms of blocks last season, but he still wasn't as strong as he could have been in terms of steals. He did better in terms of deflections and disrupting offensive sets in that way, but another step in his evolution on the defensive end. I don't want this to sound like I need Ja to be the best two-way player on the Grizzlies. He's probably never going to be that. What I need Ja Morant to do, or what we as a contingent focusing on the Grizzlies should hopefully see from Ja, is more balance on that end. He continues to grow. He continues to get better, but more, right? The continued pursuit of more, finding opportunities for himself in transition, getting out on the run off of plays that he makes on the defensive end, intercepting passes, seeing where the ball is being swung, being a step ahead of the defense. He's always going to be the straw that stirs the drink offensively, and a majority of his energy is always going to be on that end. But if he could continue to be work his way towards being a net neutral defensive player, that'll make his offensive weaponry all the more effective. And if that occurs, cash in some MVP bets. Ja Morant's going to be in that mix. Speaking of bets, Betonline.net is your number one source for basketball betting information, but also football betting information in the season that is currently underway. Find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis of every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source and place of support for all your sports wagering needs. All your articles, all the different things that you could use for live betting up to the minute scores for every possible sport, MLB, MMA, boxing, golf. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all those favorite games and events. And of course, including not just the NFL and college football, but the National Basketball Association. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. Bet online, where the game starts. As far as continued improvement, obviously Jaren Jackson Jr., I would argue, is the best two-way player on the Memphis Grizzlies. Ja Morant, who we just had a conversation about in terms of growth, being the best overall player, of course. Desmond Bane is massively important to this team moving forward. He has kind of supplanted Brandon Clark as that guy who is the core cog of this machine. And it sounds like Brandon Clark is going to get an extension and be in Memphis for a few more years, but Desmond Bane is certainly going to get an extension. He's going to get similar money, almost certainly, to what Jaren Jackson Jr. has been able to enjoy. And with that in mind, that puts Desmond in a position to really take on more ownership of both ends of the floor. Desmond does a good job defensively, offensively. He's a massive weapon, especially from three. But Bane's growth is another continued point, and folks pointing to him as a most improved player candidate this coming season, not just because Ja Morant gives him the award, excuse me, but because he earns it on his own. Bane going from year 2 to year 3, how does he make another leap, putting him into, bottom rung all-star contendership? And for me, it comes down to shot selection for Desmond Bane. Obviously, he's already one of the most impactful scorers in the entire National Basketball Association in terms of efficiency. He was in the 81st percentile per cleaning the glass and effective field goal percentage. He was 83rd percentile in points per shot attempts. So that is included among some of the very best scorers that the NBA has to offer. And in year 2 for Desmond Bane, he was that impactful, which is pretty darn impressive. But he can still get better in terms of production, which is pretty fascinating when you actually dive into the numbers a little bit. In terms of shot frequency, again, this is per cleaning the glass, only 20% of Desmond Bane's shots came at the rim. That's remarkable when you think about it. He did not attack the basket consistently. Now you're probably listening to this and you're thinking, well, he doesn't need to. He's got Ja Morant. He's got Ja Morant in the mix. That's true and that's fair. But Bane's not always going to play alongside Ja Morant. And even when he does, diversifying the offense, especially in the half court, and making it more versatile will lead to less predictability. And Desmond Bane, as of now, you've heard DeMichael say it on this show. Teams know that Bane's the shooter. They call him out every night in and night out. Get the shooter, close out on the shooter. Bane with a bullet from beyond the arc. And he's earned that reputation. He was, outside of Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, the very best three-point shooter in the NBA last season, top 5 at the very least. But only 20% of his shots came from the rim. Again, that leads to some predictability. 4 times out of 5, he is shooting from outside the lane. And then in terms of his overall three-point shot consumption, 9% of his overall shot attempts were from the corners. The easiest three-point shot there is, and only 9% came from the corners. Now, again, there's logical explanations for this. Desmond Bane was that freaking good from every other spot around the three-point arc. Then maybe you allow the corner to be open for a Zaire Williams, for a DeAnthony Melton or Kyle Anderson that are no longer on the team. Moving forward, Jake LaRavia. Maybe you give that Santi Aldama, you give that space to those guys, and let them cook a little bit from there because Bane is so good everywhere else. But again, he's your best three-point shooter, and he's only taking 9% of his total shots from the corner. That's 27th percentile among wings in the NBA last season. He was average to good in these spots in terms of his percentages, 50th, 60th percentiles, both at the rim and from the corner. So not elite, but good. These are places that he could find a way to make himself even more efficient and effective offensively. He has a great mid-range game. He does a lot of pull-up stuff off of screens, off of the dribble, his work in the summer league, and then obviously in the offseason, prioritizing being a better ball handler and initiator of offense. All that holds tremendous value and tremendous weight. However, Desmond Bane, outside of Ja Morant, is your best offensive weapon, and it's not particularly close. How do you get him in positions to be less predictable? How do you diversify his shot selection? How do you make him tougher to defend? Continuing to develop that partnership with Steven Adams, who had a remarkable season as a passer and creator, in particular with Desmond Bane. How do you put Bane in positions to get to the corner more? Is it off of screens, backdoor cuts, running the baseline? Is it off of elevator door kinds of sets where you have screens set around him? Hammer looks. There's all sorts of different types of plays and schematic adjustments that can be made to get Bane in those spots to make, again, his game a little less predictable. You know Bane can shoot the three. You know that he has the capacity to hit the pull-up mid-range jumper, but he has taken 29%. Only 29% of his shots came from arguably the two most efficient areas on the NBA floor to shoot, the corner three and at the rim. That makes what Bane did last season all the more impressive, and it makes my slightly awkward man crush on him, a la John Oliver and Adam Driver, all the more intriguing. But he is a player that still, again, room to grow. And this should make Memphis Grizzlies fans very, very excited because you're looking at a realistic opportunity for your two best players, Ja Morant mentioned in the first segment, Desmond Bane now. They can continue to improve. And in Bane's specific case, I would argue it's even easier than in Morant's because you know Bane already has the stroke. You know he can always do it. Ja has that passing capacity that we talked about, but defensively, it's almost like he would have to add a physical layer to his game or improve upon his conditioning, which is already pretty stout considering how high his usage was. It feels like or looks like Morant becoming that defensive guy that can make his own transition opportunities more consistently, that might be more difficult than just getting Desmond Bane better looks at the rim and Desmond Bane better looks on the corner three. That is much more within the realm of what Taylor Jenkins wants to do. That is much more in terms of the possibility of Bane getting more chances to be the lead scorer with Ja Morant off the floor. That reserve unit, I don't know if you know this, folks, that reserve unit doesn't have a ton of scoring, okay? Zaire Williams, John Conchar, Tyus Jones, Brandon Clark, all those guys are good basketball players, and it's a testament to the development system of the Memphis Grizzlies that they can do what they've done and still be considered a contender. But somebody's got to score the ball at some point. And when you look at scoring, the third best option right now, Dillon Brooks, probably is not the model of efficiency. So you want someone leading that second unit that's able to create off the dribble, create for himself, and be able to score in a multitude of ways. That's Desmond Bane. And I think that's where Bane is really going to earn his money or his future money in terms of a contract extension is when he shows how the bag is expanded in terms of putting the ball in the bucket. He has to be able to get more looks from the corner. He has to be able to get more looks at the rim. That will make him even more impactful, even more deadly. And it'll allow for people like Ja Morant to have better looks when they share the floor together. It will put players like Zaire Williams in a spot to be able to use their length and their size. Zaire Williams at 6'10" potentially on the wing, 6'9" for sure. That is a matchup nightmare for opposing defenses. Bane adding to his skill set and adding to his repertoire of what he can do in terms of shooting the ball, especially at the rim and from the corner, it only adds additional things that opposing defenses need to prep for and plan for. and that will make the Grizzlies offense all the more dangerous. Speaking of that Grizzlies offense, when we come back, we are going to dive further into what the team overall needs to improve upon. You've heard me harp on one of the items already on these Locked On airwaves, but what else can the Grizzlies do to really kind of hunker down and improve within heading into the season? We'll talk about that next on Locked On Grizzlies. The half-court offense of the Memphis Grizzlies has to get better. You probably have heard, read, seen that every which way from all sorts of different Memphis Grizzlies content producers. What you probably haven't thought about as much, at least not yet, is how that is going to happen with Jaren Jackson Jr. out of the fold, because Jaren is a big technically, but he really prioritizes his offensive game as a wing in a lot of ways. He can handle a little bit. He looks for mismatches. He's very difficult to defend. Draymond Green has said so himself on his own podcast during that series this past spring. So without Jaren, you lose some of that versatility, not just defensively, of course, but offensively as well. And the transition opportunities may be fewer and more far between because of the departures of DeAnthony Melton and Kyle Anderson, who folks like to continue to try to shun those guys and make it sound like that's not that big of a deal. Not here. Not with me. All right. Those two, especially in the regular season, were important cogs of the Grizzlies machine. So their impact has to be reaggregated somehow. I think that when you look at their half-court offense, that of the Memphis Grizzlies, they were 22nd last year. And I'm going to kind of sound like a hypocrite. DeAnthony and Kyle didn't help in that area, right? I think that's fair to say. Transition opportunities were where those two guys really thrived. DeAnthony Melton was a microwave scorer, and Anderson wasn't a scorer at all. So perhaps it's a bit of addition by subtraction, replacing those guys with more John Conchar, who has shown the ability to score pretty efficiently, with a rookie like the David Roddy, Jake LaRavia. Those are dudes that really have a potential opportunity to help the offense because of what they're able to do in the half court, especially LaRavia with his jump shot. But Roddy looks a lot like Kyle Anderson in a lot of ways, just in a position where maybe he can score the ball a little bit better than Kyle. Maybe not right away, but eventually. Again, that idea of addition by subtraction, I think there might be something to that in the half court. We mentioned Ja and Bane, obviously all of the areas that they need to grow and improve on. That will help. I could also see a realm of possibility where Dylan Brooks is returned. You got to keep in mind, Morant, Bane, Brooks, Jackson Jr., and Adams didn't play together a ton last year because of a variety of injuries. When Dylan was out, Ja was in. When Ja was out, Dylan was in. All around, there was lots of chances for these guys to kind of miss each other, crossing in the darkness, not being able to log a ton of playing time together. We have no idea what this offense can do in a large sample size with those guys all on the floor. Oh, and by the way, now Dylan and Ja are healthy, but you don't have Jaren to start the season. So we still don't have a full comprehension of how the Grizzlies are going to look when all of their pieces are in play. But they have to continue to, again, through Bane and Ja, and then across the offense, they have to diversify. They have to make themselves less predictable. And you're seeing a movement towards that across the entire NBA. It's not just the Grizzlies that need to do this. The complete abandonment of the mid-range jumper has negatively impacted some offense. If you have a wide open jumper and you're an NBA player and you practice it consistently and you know by muscle memory, you've watched and studied film, you can get that shot off and be pretty consistent with it. That doesn't mean that you forego an open three or a drive to the basket. Those are still better shots. But the complete nullification of that aspect of the game, I think you're going to start seeing a bounce back toward the mid-range being not necessarily a priority, but being something that teams don't run away from. And you see it in the games of Desmond Bane. I think you'll see Ja Morant. There's conversations about improving his mid-range jumper. That is all going to continue to help this Grizzlies offense because those are your two main offensive weapons. Ball movement. In the absence of true creation, you're going to have to find ways to swing the ball. Tyus Jones can't do it by himself with that reserve unit. You have to find ways to continue to kick the ball out and through, passing on a good shot to get to a great shot, physically moving without the ball. It can't just be pick and rolls, right? I'm hopeful that an area of growth of Taylor Jenkins is more not just out of timeout or after timeout sets, but within the scheme of the offense that is beyond just pick and roll, trying to get looks for Desmond Bane, Zaire Williams, trying to see what these guys can do within set offense. Taylor Jenkins is a big believer in giving his team freedom within an overall philosophy offensively. That's all well and good, but you also want to put your players in the best position to be successful. And that didn't happen all the time because players sometimes can misread circumstances and situations. It's walking and balancing the idea of giving ownership to these guys while also being in a space as a coach to say, this is what's best for the team in this moment, not just negating that or passing that, delegating that along down the line. I would like to see this offense really prioritize the kinds of shots that they're getting, the moments in the games where they're getting those shots, and really allowing for Taylor Jenkins to not necessarily take control of the scheme, because obviously the team had success last year. It's about picking and choosing your spots better to allow the roster to be in positions where they can thrive. Desmond Bane shouldn't just camp out in a corner. He should be able to come off of screens, run around, get looks from three consistently, not just on out of timeout possessions. Ja Morant needs to play off the ball more, or he needs to initiate a set and then get some backdoor cuts and screens to the basket. You really need to see this offense put the pedal to the metal, not in terms of tempo, but in terms of intensity of set plays. It can't just be, here's what we do in a generic sense, play within yourselves within that system. There's value to that, and you hear the players talk about how great that is. The next step for this roster is really being able to execute sets that will hurt the opposing defense and not just be a general conversation about what that defense is going to do to the offense that's in place. You got to evolve and adapt, or you're going to die. And I do see this team not being willing to do that in terms of the dying aspect of basketball. I do see them adapting some, and I look forward to seeing what those adaptations look like, starting with preseason games here coming soon. Tomorrow's show will feature some potential lineups. Again, DeMichael and I will hopefully be back together, and we can talk through, replacements at the 4, how much Tyus and Josh should play together, Tyus Jones and Ja Morant. What are we looking forward to seeing Taylor Jenkins trot out there as potential pairings, trios, all the way up through lineups, heading into training camp and through the preseason? Thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On Fantasy Basketball with Josh Lloyd. He's had me on the show before. Big fan of Josh. It's the #1 daily fantasy basketball show on the planet. It is free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for so much for joining me on this episode. Hopefully Ja Morant and Desmond Bane aren't too mad at me, but it's all in the idea of how this team can continue to internally develop. And to their credit, they've been phenomenal at that, arguably the best in the entire NBA at that these last 3 years. Year 4 is going to be another step in that direction. And these are just some ideas to how the team can take that next step without having to make that major deal, which they seem so averse to doing, understandably so. I'm Joe Mullinax. Thanks for checking out Locked On Grizzlies. Until next time, we'll catch you here on LO.